I'm curious about yours, Stefan, actually. Your question was, where can one find colonialism in Sweden? Where can Sweden be found in colonialism? Can you tell me a little bit more deeper about your thoughts when you did write down these two questions?
We did a gathering in Norrköping a few years back, where I tried to bring in most of the people, intellectuals, academics, who have written in one way or the other about Sweden and colonialism. And I think the interesting question in that proposition is this "and", because it's problematic for us in the sense that Sweden has not considered itself to be not a major and perhaps not even a colonial power at all, but there is this other history that's usually put forth, which is the history about Sweden as as a nation, as a state supporting the anti-colonial struggles. And then we discovered that Sweden has been part of the colonial history too, but we don't know quite in which way, and we don't know how to write the history of colonialism and Sweden. And this is why I chose to formulate it in this way, that, okay, so the question is to find out where Sweden is in colonialism. And you can make a number of different replies, and it's just not like it's not the easy answer is just to say that Sweden was complicit in the slave trade or the sugar industry in the Caribbean, but there are more. I mean, I think there is a different answer too, and it has to do with all the wealth that Sweden is part of the rich. It's one of the richest countries in the world, and it has to do with colonialism in one way or the other, because it was colonialism that created the wealth of the Western world and that brought the West up, and it brought India down and China down and Africa down and all the other parts of the world were brought down when Europe was going up. And so Sweden has enjoyed the benefits of that. And but it's difficult to describe exactly how, and it has to do with this question of economic injustice and migration. So I'll stop talking here, because I'm not just going to lecture here. So I'll throw it over to you, Göran, because you raised the question about who should benefit from this world's resources, and let's talk about the real inequalities in today's world, and how colonialism has anything to do with it. Because you did these great films. They are about the first one. They are about anti-racist struggles and anti-colonial struggles. In the first one, Black Power mixtapes in the United States, we use sort of archive film and put it together in an original way about the Black Power movement. And then the second one about Frantz Fanon, who is the iconic anti-colonial thinker, and not just an anti-colonial thinker. He's a humanist thinker. He's a universal thinker in many ways. But one of the things with both Fanon and Black Power, they saw the economic injustice as a kind of root cause of racism. They gone to South Africa, and they sort of exploited the apartheid system, and in Liberia with the Lamco, which is probably the worst example. But this demands, the only thing I'm saying is that this demands a different kind of narrative than the kind of standard French, British, Dutch, Belgium, which had their colonies, and they had a state-supported colonialism, and Sweden had that in the 17th century. But since that, and in the 19th century with Saint-Barthélemy, but it's a different narrative that has to be constructed. And the only thing I'm saying is that we don't yet have that narrative. Do you accept that?
But I wanna just make a sure nuance to both the question, because I think what you're talking about is it is the conundrum of that experience, right? It's like maybe if we question post-colonialism, right? If we question the present moment, if we question the colonial moment in which stories as the Lancome are presented, maybe we will obtain a different answer, right? Like, for instance, I'm thinking in the question I ask, which I'm going to read it for the audience, no? How much does the formulation of asylum and refugee program and its configuration in the urban space in the 1960s and 1970s determine the current sociopolitical juncture preempting social interaction, which is exactly what you're talking about, no? Like this sense of ghettoization of certain communities because the way in which they were inscribed into the society here at a particular moment. And that is in the sense that, because, I mean, I'm going to tell you just my experience and then I go. I mean, I cannot talk about the experience of living as a black person in Sweden. But I had gone to Tensta. And then I was in the metro, no? And I can totally have a different experience going, I don't know in which stop is a place called Fabriken, something like that. It's an art center that is farther south in Stockholm.
Fabriken.
Fabriken, yeah?
Okay, yeah.
So from that stop to Tensta, I could totally see how the community changed. And that for me talks about exactly this moment in which, of course, there is a sense of denial, at the same time that there is a correspondent in the physical space of the city of where these communities are inscribed.
Actually, what I want to come back to is that I want to link between the question Göran have to us today, which is a very good question. It's time to talk about economic justice. But at the same time, that's why I want to go back to Stefan's question, where do we put Sweden in the colonial history? And the answer is between them, because it is a big problem when we hear researchers as Göran and politicians who make decisions in this country denial the part of Sweden's colonial heritage. Because if we don't pick up the truth and talk about it truly and show it truly, then we cannot talk about Göran's questions, the economic justice, which the part of majority of us, of average Swedes, are living in the real life and every day.
But can I also try to, I mean, because I was born in Spain and my family is from Equatorial Guinea, and I have grown up in a place in which I feel the fact of blackness, as Fanon did. No? We all experience that. We all grow up not knowing that we are post-colonial subject until somebody else has pointed out that this is who you are. This is the sort of like the theoretical background in which you are inscribed when this is not part of your interest. And I want to say that one of the things that you do in the movies, even though there are one on the anti-imperialist struggle in the States and the second one on the struggle for the liberation movement that link to the third world, is to talk about the sense of humanness. I mean, I think in my experience of living here, very, very remotely coming back and going while I was preparing this show, I think even trying to ask myself these kind of questions in relation to my Africanness, for instance, right? And thinking on how address that in the context of an exhibition like Jipka, right? What I think the most important thing is to start asking these conversations in terms of human, right? You need, and this is the sense of economic justice, social justice, etc., that we can claim. If we start, or if we remind, and I'm saying this, of course, generalizing, but understanding the violence that have been inflicted to people like us, but also, and they continue to be inflated in many respects. We probably are privileged in comparison with many other people that perhaps is not represented in this room. But I think it is a matter of start talking in a different way, because otherwise we will go back and end it in the same responses that we have been here. So let's start talking about humans in general and confronting the experience of certain humans within the context of a larger society.
To me, it's like the most white Swedish people are trying to deny the history. They try to deny the racism, and actually our feeling as Afro-Swedes when we talk about Afrophobia. Afrophobia is that special racism that are directed to black people in the society. And me myself, I'm actually tired of that denial because I hear it every day in newspapers, researchers, politicians, media people, and in everyday life. And I'm really, really tired about it. Of course, I'm not generalizing and say that all the white people are not trying to deny the history, or like I always say in Swedish, sopa det under den blågula mattan, to put it under the blue flag and just deny that there doesn't exist. And I'm tired about it, and I see it as a big problem actually, is that if we don't talk about the history as it is and accept it, we cannot go forward, then we cannot talk about economical justice. And that's a big step. Of course, we should not just stay in the history. We should, of course, talk about today, what's happening today. But there is a link between these two, which is very important, and we cannot cut it.
No, I totally agree, and I think that we have a memorial or a ceremony after this to acknowledge the date it was Swedish slavery were abolished on paper. That is, I think, when I say the society upside down, I think that calls for a review of history to see that day when, if we're talking about Africa, we can talk about so many other places and circumstances and so on, but when the kidnapping started and the looting and the robbery is going on and on and on, if we go back, we could celebrate, but honor, horrified by the day Sweden started the slave trade as well. So I think we have to reverse that and see it from day one, or whatever you call it, to have a chance to have a different perspective. But connecting to it goes back and forth, but why Sweden has this problem to acknowledge the colonial past was, like, I think you were said that Sweden was also a driving force in the anti-colonial fight, especially in South Africa, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and 80s. So that image came from that. Interesting, however, is like the social democracy and Olof Palme, if we pack them together, he was obviously a peace dove by day and an arms trader by night. It's connected, and it's scary how connected the Swedish arms trade is, and how the history of arms trade. Follow the arms trade history and see where. It's not a coincidence. I think it's 6 or 7 liberation movements in Africa who has a Swedish weapon in their logo, and the Palestinian. And it wasn't like the Social Democrats gave them the guns. They bought it from dealers. So that's how you could see the Swedish role, dealing arms and trying to perpetuate anti-colonialism. So it's a tremendous work, and to follow up on the question from when I'm talking, you don't have to put those notes. You can just say something because I will be relieved. But if you're talking, why we did this film, because I say all of Frans Fanon's work is not for me to touch upon. But this book, Wretched of the Earth, I think, among other things, is an outcry to the European people, also meaning the North Americans and even the Chinese now. It's an outcry for the workers, the ordinary people in Europe, to understand what's going on under structural violence, colonialism, blah blah blah. So I didn't do that I did it to my fellow Europeans or North Americans. I was just blown away with that text, and I'm not. We have to try to do that as well, but it's a collective effort.
But I want to say something about this white people in the how to what was the question, to combat or to fight racism in Sweden. Because I think it's an interesting situation today. There is so much so-called Afrophobia, and when I'm doing so, I'm not sort of denying the phenomenon, but I'm sort of the word itself is problematic. But there is so much racism directed against black people, and it's increasing. And at the same time, there is a momentum among, I mean, a lot of black, svartskallar, blattar, organizations. There's a lot of, whether they're immigrant, minorities, non-white organizations, who are taking the lead in this fight. And I think this is good, and I think there are too many sort of, I think that this kind of struggle is now at a kind of really interesting point where precisely white anti-racists like myself are trying to find a position in this and trying to do useful work. And I think this is good in a way, because that means that people like me, white anti-racist Swedes, have to rethink our strategies as well. Whereas previously we'd just been preaching, right? Preaching anti-racism, and we've been preaching on other people's behalf, as it were. Although I would deny that we have been doing this on our own behalf too. But that's the way it's been. But now, and I think this is all over Europe, and it's in Britain and it's in France also, that there is this precisely, we have this question, where do, I mean, it's almost like in South Africa in the anti-apartheid struggles, the anti-apartheid white militants, the communists, the anti-apartheid fighters, they ask themselves, where do we fit in? And I think there is a kind of similar situation now in this Europe today. And what I am fearing is that a lot of white intellectuals, writers, researchers are just sort of, I don't know how to put it, that they are sort of becoming more passive, that they either have to act as a kind of spokespeople, writing, taking a lead position, or they are silent. But white anti-racists have to find this position where they cannot any longer sort of formulate the problem, but where they have to do more sort of supportive work, especially in the media, and especially in television and newspapers, where there are still very, very few, very, very bad representations of blacks and other peoples who are speaking about these issues, because they are not allowed in. So I want to, I think the way to go here is to just do your own work as seriously as you can, and in the interest of humanity, and because history is so screwed up in this relationship between whites and blacks, so you don't even know where do we even start.
But can I ask you something? This relates to your question, because I think it's the only one that is not asked aloud. I don't know how much one can move forward when you still are locked in the rhetoric, whites, non-whites, us, then, right? And you ask Zacharias a question that says, now and then we hear that different national agencies, for example, schools and museums, are trying to make the organization more equal. But the equality word pursued is only consider gender. Will it be possible to start discussing equality through the perspective of ethnic discrimination? So, of course, the knowledge of the dialectics between one and the other, powerful, oppressed, etc., it is important. But as I said before, how you imagine, this is related to you, no? How you imagine telling somebody in the audience, younger generations, how you imagine making them honor of their own history, because no matter how much discrimination or discriminated they have been in the history of Sweden, this is a history they can claim. So for me, the sense of ownership is very important, and it starts in the, as you were saying, no, in a serious work that you can do in the schools. How do you imagine that happening, or is that happening? I don't
Before
know.
answering you, I would like to go back to Stefan's answer there. I agree with you, and at the same time not, because you mean that our NGOs like Afrosvenskarna are the one who have the full control over the situation about Afrophobia. We're dictating what to say, what not to say, and
No,
things like that.
I'm saying that you should be the ones who are
Yes.
formulating the problem, and
I agree with
other
you
people
there.
should listen.
But it is not that easy, because I want to give you just a small example that the Minister of Integration, Kunke, who are responsible for this kind of question, have put it out 500,000 Swedish krona to tackle the Afrophobia in Sweden. With all respect for the money, but 500 Swedish thousand krona it's nothing. And to me, that gives clear signal that the higher level politicians, they are not interested in these questions. So it means that organizations like us, we're in the middle of something I call Hunger Games. The biggest will survive. The more hungriest will survive. It means that we're there fighting against each other, which I don't like. I want the black people in Sweden, I want the Afro-Swedish people to be the one who are dictating the question, because we are the one living it. We are the one that live the Afrophobia, that feel the Afrophobia, that are targeted with the Afrophobia. Also, like you said about your question about the history, of course, history is very important. We should never deny it. We should always know our history so we can give answers. But also, we are the one who should be on the table when talking about this. And this is not the reality in Sweden today, because we are invited to tables, but we're not allowed to eat the dinner. And I cannot accept that, because I want to be on the table and I want to eat.
How can you claim that? That's my question, because I mean, I say this to you because I want to say, and that's why I want to open the question farther than Sweden, because that's the struggle of anybody, and it's not the struggle of the now. It's a struggle of always. We have seen it in other.
I want to give you an answer that we try to claim that to many levels in society, like being here in this museum, to make the museum so they can change and put the real history. So when normal Swedish people who are not Africans who have African heritage start to understand the history. So when we talk to each other, we can understand each other. There will not be this kind of denial.
Can I just make a comment? You just say the normal Swedish. There is so. I mean, I know this is super hard, and I think everyone has to make an effort to challenge that.
But you have to understand one thing when I say normal Swedish.
Yes.
I don't deny I'm Swedish. We're all sitting in this room. We're all Swedish people.
Yes.
There is no question about that.
Yes.
No, whatever question about that. But it is important to make that different between white and non-white, because it's about privilege. We live in different societies, even if we live under the same flag, the same government, we live in the same country. Because we can take a trip to Tensta, Rinkeby, Flemingsberg, Hallunda, wherever you want it, and see how people live. Yes. And you just take the subway into Östermalmstorg, to Norrmalm, to Kungsholmen, and you see how people live. Just come to my work where I work. I work in the biggest depot for trains in the North Scandinavia. And I have a very good position. I'm lucky. I have a very good position. So I sit on the 5th floor. So when I go down and see when trains come in from the central stations, they have to empty toilets. Who did that job? African people do that. When you go in and see who, just let me finish. When you go in and see who cleans the trains, African people do it. When you go into the maintenance, where they do maintenance for trains, it's white people who do it. So even if you have like a good education, you're still
But that's what
directed.
I mean. But what I'm trying to say is that, of course, I in order to be here, to be seated here, to have a seat in the table and eat my dinner, I had to struggle like everybody else. And I struggle both as a person, as much as I struggle as a black person. And that, for me, is the key. I'm not denying anything that you are saying, right? And I don't know the experience of the Swedish people here, and I know the experience of many other people in the world that feels oppressed. But I also know the experience of people that have struggled to liberate, both physically, from the physical change, and also from the mental ones that are a big pressure. No?
I want to say one thing about reparations. Yes, I think this reparations issue is coming up, and it's going to be really important, and this is going to be a huge, this is going to bring things into the open. Of course, there has to be a system of reparations and retributions for this. About schools, I wanted to tell you a story or an experience that I was called up by Forum för levande historia. This is the Göran Persson, our former prime minister. He started this thing called Forum for Living History. He did a campaign to educate, a huge educational effort when there was the result that I think 1/3 of the there was some biased investigation in schools, precisely that some percentage of the 15-year-olds doubted that the Holocaust had happened or something like that. But I mean, it turned out the investigation was probably not so well made and so forth. Anyway, so he started this institution called Forum for Living History, and I was called, and they've done some good things and some bad things, and mostly bad things, because it's turned out into this sort of anti-totalitarian sort of Nazi bashing and then communist bashing and then so anti-totalitarian anything. Anyway, they are going to do now an anti-racist campaign.
I know.
In schools. You're probably involved in it, but I was called up by someone. Maybe Oscar is here. I don't know, but a guy I didn't know. He called me up and said, "We are going to do these podcasts, and we are going to talk to 3 researchers, and they are each going to give their perspectives on racism." And I asked, because I'm usually I often do things like this, and I've been writing a lot about racism. And I asked, "So who are you asking? Who will do this?" And this is going to be offered to all the schools in the country. For teachers and the students, then high schools or probably, and they are going to have these podcasts, and I think we are going to be interviewed, the researchers, about racism. So there's going to be a historical perspective, there's going to be like Linnea and all that, and there's going to be a postcolonial perspective, and then there's going to be some other perspective, and I was going to provide a postcolonial perspective on this postcolonial theory and so on. What is racism? And they asked him, who are you asking to do this? And I think it's important that you have researchers with a non-white background doing this in the schools. And then he responded, "Well, it would be strange for me to select people according to the color of their skin," which is the typical sort of liberal answer to that question. So I was making the kind of pay attention to race, and he was saying, "Well, I don't pay attention to race, I'm colorblind."
Typical.
And then I told him, "Well, if you had a campaign about the Holocaust or anti-Semitism, would you not rather have a kind of Jewish people talking about that?" And then he became silent, because then he got the point. But still, this is the way people, I think it illustrates precisely what you are saying, that we haven't gotten that far. And then I had to explain that skin color is a kind of metaphor for different knowledges about racism. So pay attention to that. And it's important, if you go out to the schools, that you have all knowledges and not just, which was the case in fact, just white researchers talking about racism. It's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
And should I then deny this and not take this job? I don't know. I still haven't done the podcast, so I don't know. But I have the offer to do it.
Before we go to
I
the
could
questions,
say I have to respond to this.
Okay.
I think usually when people ask me after screening my film if is a favor of reparations, and I said no, you can just stop the looting and the robbery today. You don't need to pay back. You can't pay back, but because you spend the money anyway. So, and the guilt is so enormous. So stop robbering now, and everything is fine. You know, Africa, for instance, is absolutely the victim of its own riches. It's the richest continent on earth, and if they just stop stealing from it, it will be fine, no problem. But on the other hand, it would be good, and it would be good if Sweden took that step and put pressure on United Kingdom to compensate Jamaica, and blah blah blah. So why not? I think it's so important, and it's ridiculous anyway. And I'm really pumped up now, because if you go 500,000 Swedish crowns, like blah blah blah, and you, I mean, and while it's a national goal to send firefighters to Libya and bomb them. Just but try them in there till we can sell them. And you get this film for Levande Historia. They are ridiculous in every sense. Every mistake. I mean, you just say, "Oh, we're going for podcast." Wow, you really, so podcast. It's wow, go. I mean, it's those nervous attempts. How much money do they put on the film for Levande Historia? 10, 25, 50 million a year, I don't know, and they give you 500,000. It's upsetting. It's upsetting, and they think they're good in that Christian missionary.
Say it.
F word.
Say it, and I say.
No, I think. But I think no, you can, some violence, and we don't talk about the violence during the French Revolution or the American Revolution or the Haitian Revolution, the free, successful, in their own circumstances, successful revolution. Nobody blames the violence connecting to that. No, hopefully not. But what we saw in Egypt, you have to, when you have a revolution, you have to put a state of alarm. You have a revolutionary council or whatever to start all over again. You can't have an election or something like that. Then it's not a revolution. You have to, revolution is an upside down of things, and then you have to have a period with a revolutionary time, and then you start something new.
You have to kill the king.
Yeah. You had to.
At
You
least.
had to
And his
destitute power.
Exactly. So no, you can't have that. But violence happens every day, all the time. So it's we this is also something we perpetuate in the West, like Gandhi, Martin Luther King. If you behave like them, you're fine. But if you're not even, and people in Egypt, for instance, saying that non-violence, for me at least, is a method, and it's a great method. If you 800 million people with 8,000 British drunk soldiers, fine, like in India, but. You can use other method. That doesn't mean you want to commit any violence, but non-violence is just one method. Another is education and strikes and blah, 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 a lot of different actions. Sorry.
I would like to go back to the question about is it possible to fight Afrophobia? And I would like to say yes, it is possible, because things have happened actually. Everything is not bad. The Afro-Swedish organization have been active 25 years now. And we have been struggling for 25 years. And just we are sitting here and having this conversation is actually a part of a good step in the right direction. But also, I would like to remind everyone that the United Nations have declared the next 10 years as the international decade for people of African descent. Because people of African descent have it difficult all over the world, just not here in Sweden. And we need to feel solidarity with each other. We need to find each other, no matter where you are from Africa, no matter where you are, if you have a black skin. We need to find each other and to put pressure on the government to understand this question. And I think Stefan had a very perfect picture about Levande för Forum Historia, about when you tell them shouldn't people of African descent talking about this, and they say we don't talk about race. And that's a typical for Sweden. They don't want to talk about race. And many people tell me, why do you always talk about race? I say, I know there is no racism, but race is like to point the difference between the white and the non-white in the society. So you can understand the difference, because you have to understand it. But when it comes to Jewish people, it's okay to to take them in and let them talk about their feelings and what they've been through with all the respect. So I believe, yes, it is possible. Afrosvenskarna we have a goal actually to make today, the 9th of October, as a national day in Sweden. So people will start to remember what's been happening in the story. We also want a memorial like the one they have outside the United Nations with actually Sweden haven't put any money into that. Even if Sweden was asked by the United Nations to put money into that. Here in Stockholm, to remember people in the middle of Stockholm, what's been happening in the Swedish story. But most of all, as African people here in Sweden, we need to get together. We need to get together and put pressure together. And I think it's possible. And I think it's possible, and I say it again, I think it's possible.
I want to go back to two things. One is the matter of violence, and the other one is the question, and I'm paraphrasing, why we need to become researchers, or do we need to become researchers to learn that history, no? And I want to talk about violence because there are many moments very interesting in the movie concerning violence, in which violence is presented in the everyday experience. And of course, we see many cameras showing, for instance, how sort of like, probably it's in the 1960s somewhere in Rhodesia, white people, playing balls, swimming, etc. No? While the black people are the ones serving. No? Even there is this moment, very ridiculous moment, where the person that is being interviewed, which is a very harsh, but what I think, and I'm not going to unveil the movie, but I think what is interesting in that particular instance is how much violence we live today. No? You mentioned there are plantations, right? In many respects, not only for people of different races, not only for black people, but also for people of lower classes, no matter the color of the skin, right? As we say, no, there are hierarchy between the rulers and the others. No? So a revolution without violence is impossible, because a life without violence is impossible, right? Like we experience that. And it's understanding that violence, embracing what it means in terms of the uplifting moments that one can find in that, where, at least for me, is the solution, right? Then there is another question. I don't know who asked the question, if I can ask and put you on the spot, do we need to become researchers to learn that history? Yeah? I would like to say, to you in particular, but to anybody that had that in their mind, you don't, right? Ask your family. Ask your family to tell you the stories of your family, or how they came here. The epic stories and the storytellings of your community, of other communities. But not only people from African descent, people around the world. There are so many stories about Swedish blonde and blue eyes that we don't know, that I don't know. And I'm very interested in those stories. I think it's very important that we take matters in our own hands. And that, so to speak, could be considered violence, because you're breaking out from the conditions in which whoever is considering you a marginal person has put you. So your gesture of radical ownership, right? Because one of the things that is beautiful about what I've experienced doing this project, it's not that I want to make publicity of the biennial, but there are so many works that reflect on the period in which concerning violence is presented in the book. There are so many moments in which we are talking about planetary thinking, we are talking about people, we are talking about all of us. I don't see anybody here different from me, no, in that respect. And we can see in those elements of history things that matters to us nowadays, but also things that can help us to look at the future, no? And in that sense, we are actors and narrators of our own history. History is participatory. The problem is that sometimes we don't see, as Fanon says, our traces in the history. Sometimes we don't feel we belong, and we had to claim for that. And I'm very grateful that you asked that question, because I think it's important that we all understand that this is something that we can do on ourselves. Very little, just the story of your family, just, that's your own story, but this is also a Swedish story. And I think it's important to collect that.